Last of Us is one of the best video games of all time. Fun gameplay and mechanics, interesting character designs, and meaningful writing all packed into one story game set in the zombie apocalypse. And like any product that was near perfect in its original form, it must be adapted into another medium. And don't get me wrong, adapting a video game into a film hasn't always turned out bad. I mean, look at Detective Pikachu or Sonic 2. Jesus Christ, are those really the best options for video games turning into movies? Well, luckily, there is a new game adaptation, where The Last of Us is now turned into a TV show. The show, right off the bat, opened to intensely high praise, with many calling it not only the best video game adaptation by a long shot, but also one of the best shows in recent memory. And while I most certainly will not go to that high of praise, I will say that it's definitely not the worst thing you could be watching right now. But let's talk about The Last of Us, and why I think it can never live up to the game. Without further ado, let's talk about The Last of Us. The introduction is very short and consists of Joel's daughter going to bed, getting out of bed, finding objects around the house, and Joel, his daughter Sarah, and his brother Tommy trying to make it out of the town in the midst of the zombie apocalypse and ultimately failing to make it out. The intro is quick and to the point, but I would have enjoyed to see some actual backstory, and in the show they give us exactly that. Before I talk about this episode itself, I just want to say how much they nailed the opening theme song. The song is a shortened version of the theme you will hear in the game, and I'm glad they stuck with the game's original song, because one of my favorite things about the Last of Us game was the score itself. The visuals are pretty nice as well, showing the fungi moving around and creating different shapes while the credits are played. The episode starts with a conversation between two scientists and a host in 1968 on what seems to be a talk show, explaining that parasitic fungus can live in ants and basically control them like a zombie. But that fungi cannot survive in humans because the fungi cannot survive in an organism that's internal body temperature is over 94 degrees. But the scientists say that if the Earth were to warm up and the fungi were to adapt and evolve, the fungi could live in humans, reach their brain, and control them. The reason that this scene is so well made and powerful is because it gives reasonable explanation for zombies, something that most zombie-based media has rarely ever touched on. Not only this, but the scene is just over 3 minutes and explains this concept effectively, but also in an entertaining way, with cuts to the crowd and camera crew and the reactions, jokes from the host to further convey that this is indeed a mostly light-hearted talk show, and convincing banter from one scientist to another. The rest of the episode after that is sadly not on that same level as the first scene, but is still a worthy expansion of the game's opening scene. The show gives us more scenes with Joel and Sarah, which is much appreciated, given that in the game they only really have one scene together that isn't them running for their lives. The scene where Sarah gives Joel his fixed watch is a really nice moment that doesn't express the characters too well, but seeing these two in a normal setting is basically enough for me to be satisfied and charmed. In the show, there is a bit more expansion on the world as well, with Sarah trying to repair Joel's watch for his birthday and going to the repair shop, and Sarah spending time with her elderly neighbors. Probably my favorite moment in the entire show is when you see Sarah in her neighbor's house talking to one of them while the extremely old lady she usually has to take care of is in the background seemingly turning into a zombie in a disturbing and disorienting way. It is a very subtle but terrifying moment that was executed perfectly. Really wish there were more moments like this in the show, but oh well. Once Sarah gives her dad the fixed watch, it's basically just a recreation of the game. Some of the shots, namely the one from the view of the car, are very striking with great composition. The visuals on the first episode are at least very slick, with a crispy camera feel in the daytime and a cooler black neon feel for the nighttime. The episode is also paced very well, with most scenes not being stretched out too far because I did fear they would. The intro to the game is something that is usually annoying to those that are replaying the game for the second or third time because they already know what happened and they just want to get through to the action. But in the first episode of the show, they kind of have the same rule that they have to follow, and they nail it, while still adding more. I definitely won't be saying this as much for the rest of the series, but for the intro at least, it is superior to the game. They didn't add too much, and the things they did add further explained our characters and setting in a very concise way. Sure, the characters aren't developed too well, with Joel straight up having like 10 normal lines of dialogue in the entire episode, but I like it that way. Introducing these characters in a really complex and overabundant way would be a waste of time because we have the rest of the show for that. And the writers know that it would be much less interesting to cram all this obvious character development down our throats before the zombie apocalypse even begins. The episode really is sad to me in one way, that being that it got my expectations just a little too high for the rest of the series, given that the pilot of a show is usually one of the worst episodes, and this turning out to be one of, if not my favorite episode of the show is just really sad. Still, that doesn't take away from this episode being great. I really did enjoy it. Nothing really blew me away except for that opening interview with the scientists and the creepy lady being turned into a zombie in the background of that one scene, but this is still a very watchable episode of television and is a more than worthy adaptation of the game's prologue. And this is an 8 out of 10. Not to just burst through the door yelling, but this is what I mean by getting my expectations too high. Episode 2 is bad. I guess that is sort of a hot take given that many say this is a great episode because I've never seen a single negative article, video, or blog post about this episode, but I really was just not impressed. You know how I said the first episode improves on the game by adding a few new aspects? This episode does the opposite. Not only is it much worse than the game, but I would also argue that it doesn't really add anything too different to the story. To be fair, transferring this segment of the game into television form was honestly never going to be easy. The reason the first episode was so easy to convert was because the part they converted was basically just all cutscene. I'm not taking anything away from the first episode, I'm just saying it was probably the easiest episode to create, plot execution-wise. But this segment is completely different, with it basically all consisting of gameplay. This segment is just you walking around the city and killing zombies with guns or melee weapons. And in the episode, they kill 1 zombie. By comparison, you have to kill at least 10 zombies in the game, and that is what takes up most of the time, which leads to the main problem with the episode: the pacing. This episode is paced absolutely horrifically. Because they only kill 1 clicker the entire episode, it leaves a lot of time to develop the character. Oh. What? You're not gonna do that. They're just gonna walk around the city for a ridiculous and unnecessary amount of time? This was the one episode that it would have fit to have some extra display of certain characters' emotions and personalities before it completely shifts in the next episodes to come. And they just wasted the opportunity entirely. There's one scene with some good emotion displayed from the actress playing Tess, where she has an uncertain expression on her face that is hinting at a climax of the episode, but that is basically all you get. The lighting also felt really weird, and this is an issue that will occur several times throughout the show, but it is especially apparent here. And that is the fact that many times the scenes in which windows have light shining through look weirdly overexposed. I don't know if anyone else had this issue, but it was very off-putting, especially given how strangely it affected the characters. It's like the light wasn't even hitting them, and yet it clearly should be. I know that this is a nitpick, but it is just really annoying and distracting. The general dialogue was extremely mediocre, with some boring, snarky comments from Ellie, and basically just annoyed grunts from Joel. Another issue that starts here and becomes more apparent as the show goes on is Ellie's writing. Her insults in the game aren't great, and they really don't need to be, but other than that, Ellie's writing is really good. She has realistic and appreciative dialogue all the time, and in the show, it's just not really the case. She never really has one good piece of dialogue in this episode, and she ends up going through no changes as a result. This is something that will get better as the show goes on, but for now, it is pretty annoying. Also, the big change they made this episode is that instead of killing humans at the Firefly meetup spot, they have to kill zombies by blowing up the entire place. I get why they did it. It was able to be a lot quicker and honestly more climactic, but I still honestly liked how raw and realistic the game's original Fedra fight scene felt. Not much more to talk about this episode. I guess for the one positive I did have, the design of the mushroom zombie was really cool looking, although that might not even be a compliment given that they were supposed to look scary, and the word I would use is cool. So yeah, not feeling too good about this episode. 3 out of 10. Episode 3. I have very little to say about this episode. It was a quick, nice experiment that worked out pretty well but did not blow me away. showing the humanity of everyone is a big part of The Last of Us, and it felt a bit cheap to pack most of that into this flashback episode, but I digress. It's not bad. The direction is pretty nice, with less cuts than the rest of the show, and a lot more close-ups than usual. It was nice to show something positive coming out of the apocalypse, but once again, it just felt like a pretty forced narrative, especially after only 2 episodes of the show. A flashback episode just felt kinda weird. Bill and Frank are both written very well, with 2 distinct personalities almost opposite of each other, and most of the technical aspects are handled well, but it just felt like a roadblock in the series. The saving grace of this episode to me is the parallels with the show, or rather the ending of the show. This episode shows Bill and Frank dying on their own terms, and whether you think that was the right decision or not, the opposite choice is reflected in the last episode, which shows Joel deciding to save Ellie instead of possibly curing the world of this fungus. I really do like what they were going for there, especially given that Bill and Frank both make the decision together, while in the last episode, Joel makes the decision for Ellie. They really are 2 opposite choices. In that respect, the episode really succeeds in being either a prologue or epilogue, but I don't know. It just really didn't need to happen. Unfortunately, the window lighting sadly is way too bright again, but luckily this kind of stops happening soon. I mean, it was nice to see these 2 men's relationship form, but I did not really need this episode, and it doesn't really fit in this show. Still a good episode of television, however, and I'm giving this one a 6 out of 10. Episode 4 is one of the more forgettable episodes of the show, but I really kind of like it. It is probably the biggest risk the show has ever taken by adding a completely different storyline with a main villain. The episode shows Ellie and Joel going through the city, but eventually being stopped by a sort of rebellion that has taken over the city. There is actually another scene I really liked in this one where Ellie saves Joel's life and is forced to use a gun to kill someone. It is a pretty powerful scene and shows substantial change in both of their characters, where now Joel can put more trust in Ellie, and Ellie can put more trust in herself. Sure, the same scene happens in the game more or less, but I think the moment was better built up in the show, with the direction focused on Ellie instead of Joel. The main villain is also built up pretty well, with a believable revenge plot against Henry, a fugitive who is hiding in the city after ratting out the main villain's brother to Fedra to get medicine for his brother. Quite a mouthful. The main villain also acted very well, with her snarky and righteous anger being apparent throughout. Sure, the society itself is not really explained or explored, but I guess knowing the leader pretty well is good enough. There really isn't too much to talk about in this episode, given that the main change is the main villain that is even a bigger part in the next episode. And you know how I say the window lighting stops being bright soon? Well, that means this episode. I don't know why it stopped being an issue out of nowhere, but sure, I'll take it. After one scene in this episode that I think is kind of strange with the window lighting, it just completely stops. So yeah, a pretty good episode, but not the most memorable. 6 out of 10. Episode 5 is easily one of my favorite episodes. The structure is smart and unusual, the acting is phenomenal, and the visuals are fantastic. Let me start with the structure. The episode starts with some backstory on the 2 brothers, Henry and Sam. It shows their journey so far throughout the city and how they try to escape. It shows how much Henry cares for his younger brother Sam, who is deaf due to leukemia. Sure, the backstory is a little overdone and kind of feels like the show is trying to make their deaths as sad as possible, but it's not too much to the point where it feels forced. The only reason this isn't my absolute favorite episode of the series, although most people would say it is because the main gut punch at the end that carries the episode was solely from the game, and therefore, I can't really give the show too much credit. But I do maintain that the plot is very well done, with the final confrontation between Kathleen and Henry being stressful and entertaining. That one shot of all the zombies piling out of a pit because of that truck falling and making a loud bang is a great example of a good decision made by the show, given that this is one of the most exciting climaxes out of the entire show. Another nice change made by the TV show is a scene near the end between Ellie and Sam. The scene is where Sam shows Ellie the bite, and Ellie tries to use her blood to heal him. It once again shows a different side to Ellie, with her trying to be sweet and compassionate, even if she is pretty delusional in that moment. The visuals in this episode are probably the biggest standout from this episode in particular, with the great set design in the hideout Henry and Sam were using, along with some above average CGI fire, which is usually obvious and distracting, but in this episode is actually really well done. The dialogue between Henry and Joel in the scenes they have together is really powerful and gives Joel someone to relate to, and even though he never says it, you can tell he appreciates having Henry there to help. The last scene is still incredibly depressing. I'm glad they didn't screw it up, but at the same time, they really didn't go for anything different. But I really can't be too mad because the most likely change would be to make Henry and Sam's death scene even more depressing, which I really don't think anyone needs. Overall, this is a really good episode, and is probably the best episode since the first. 8 out of 10. And honestly, episode 6 is actually a really great episode as well. It begins with a flashback to the horrific end of the last episode, and after this reminder, we jump to 3 months later, where a man is returning to his cabin in the snow after hunting, and he finds his wife held at gunpoint by Joel. Joel asks if they have seen his brother or if they can point them in the direction where he might be, and they tell him across the river, but also that they should not go past the river because it is really dangerous and no one has ever come out of there alive. This opening scene is another great addition to the story, with some great humor between Ellie and the old couple at the cabin, and a reason to go into the direction they end up heading in. Once they arrive at the town and meet Joel's brother, the episode plays out like a straight-up drama, and the show pulls it off as well, with Ellie's speech to Joel being even more impactful with great physical emotion from Bella Ramsey. There really isn't much action in this episode until the end, but I think that works just fine because of the fantastic performances. And something I have started to notice by this point is just how different Ellie feels in the show compared to the game. Ellie is much snarkier than she was in the game, mainly because we just get to see more of her personality in the show, but it is somewhat of a change. She's much more rude to anyone she doesn't know, and I honestly think it works better, whereas in the game she didn't have much of a personality one way or another. I also noticed that Joel is a lot more compassionate in the show, whereas in the game he was less trusting and honest. Don't get me wrong, he is still stoic, but it just feels like he has more moments of kindness to a point where you can really empathize with his decision to leave Ellie with his brother. Speaking of Joel's brother, I think his character was much improved compared to the game. He is a lot more welcoming to Joel and Ellie when they arrive, and doesn't have as short of a fuse when talking to Joel. And you can see where he is coming from when he talks about starting a family instead of just going back out and moving forward in the world. I'm really glad they made him more down to earth because in the game he was really just being a dick for basically no reason. With the improved writing, the added scene at the beginning, and great performances, this is an easy 9 out of 10. Episode 7 is another flashback episode. Great. Don't get me wrong, I love when this show decides to change it up. The added scenes and characters hold some of my favorite moments from the entire show. But taking whole episodes to just have flashbacks feels like a big roadblock, not an improved story. But let's talk about the episode. Episode 7 is not entirely original. It is loosely based on The Last of Us DLC with Ellie and her friend Riley. I have not played that DLC, so I can't say if it is a worthy adaptation or not, but what I will say is that this episode feels more necessary than the other flashback episode. Showing Ellie's relationship with Riley gives us moments of her actually being happy, which we have only really seen one time before with Sam and Henry, and we all know how that turned out. This episode has some pretty impressive lighting that feels reminiscent of Stranger Things with its neon purple mall aesthetic, which feels nice to say given that the lighting in the show used to be a problem, not a bonus. The main plot is fine. Like I said, it's cool to see Ellie happy, but it's really hard to enjoy it when you know the entire time that something terrible will happen. And when it does happen, it is heartbreaking, as per usual for this show. I don't have much to say about this one. It's okay. I enjoyed the set design, and the acting from Storm Reed was fine. Not bad, but just kinda unnecessary and tedious. I'd say this is another 6 out of 10. Episode 8 is the best episode of The Last of Us by a pretty wide margin as well. Sure, it was a pretty easy hit for me, given that this is my favorite part of the game too, but still, there are some things that the show added and took away that make this episode just as, if not more, impactful. The main villain, David, is terrifying as he should be, This is probably the best performance of the show, with an eerie, sinister tone from Scott Shepherd the entire time. In the game, I always thought his character was a great idea that could be improved, and I got exactly what I asked for here. This episode also gives a bit of context for David and his village, showing his leader position, but also showing him just being a scary creep to everyone in the town. He clearly sees himself as a godlike figure, and that much is communicated very well. Ellie and David had believable interactions with each other, showing that Bella Ramsey has great chemistry with even the villains of the show. The one thing that really bothered me about this part in the game was how David just goes from letting Ellie go for no reason to hunting her down and Joel like a madman. But in the show, it is fixed perfectly. It shows the town is hungry, not only for food, but also revenge, and David understands that the entire town will be pissed off if he doesn't do something. The second half of the episode gives us an incredibly badass scene with Ellie's character, which is even cooler now because we are watching her, not playing as her. The scene at the end where Ellie is just repeatedly stabbing David with a cleaver, but we only see her face, is maybe my favorite moment in the show, because it shows her finally understanding how incredibly fucked up people are, which results in her seeming almost completely out of it in the next episode. Sure, besides the snappier pacing and context for David, the show really didn't add too much, but I really don't think they needed to at all. They fixed the only problem I had and changed the pacing for the better, so there isn't anything to complain about. This is damn near a perfect episode of television, and the only thing that is holding it back for me is the fact that I already knew what was going to happen. 10 out of 10. Really, really good. I'm really sad to say this, but honestly, the last episode of The Last of Us is weirdly not even close to being the best. Whereas in the last episode, they didn't add too much, but the things they did add were great, in this episode, literally nothing is added. The scenes are almost word for word the same, and the only thing that is different is the fact that they don't have to cross the zombie-filled tunnel like they did in the game. The most powerful scene in the game with Joel killing everyone in the hospital is so much worse here. The loud, obnoxious strings in the background are way overabundant and make the killing spree seem much less realistic and sincere. Joel making his way to Ellie and killing all those guards is just kind of poorly pasted together with below average editing. The only thing that was different here was a mistake, which is really not a good thing. What I will say, for better or worse, is that the show makes it seem like a much worse thing that Joel is doing, whereas in the game, it felt like it kinda had to happen. Yeah, not much to talk about here, because this is basically just a dollar store version of what came before it. I'm sad to say, but this is a contender for the worst episode of the show. It just felt lazy. It felt like the creators really didn't have the same attention to detail or care that they did through the show in the beginning. So, therefore, I will have to give this one a 4 out of 10. Not terrible, but really disappointing. So that was my entire review of The Last of Us TV show. And after talking about it for so long, it made me want to reflect on the main question everyone should be asking themselves. Was it worth it? Was it worth it to adapt a literally perfect game into a not-so-perfect show? And the answer is yes. Was it necessary? Oh, absolutely not. But as it is, this gave us a lot of new material that turned out to be an overall positive, and I'd say that's pretty great. My overall rating with finding the average score of the show is a pretty solid 6.8 out of 10, but if I'm thinking of the whole thing as a collective package, I'd probably give it somewhere around a 7.5. Thank you all so much for watching. Go play The Last of Us if you have not already. Trust me, the game is amazing, and have a great day.